Hi guys. Um, just a few weeks after Harold Wilson entered number 10 Downing Street in October 1964, a young Welshman entered the recording studio in West Hampstead. His name was Tom Jones, and the song was It's Not Unusual. Well, my contention is that what had happened just a few weeks before was unusual. It's going to come in two halves. The first thing I want to do is actually set out what I think are the electoral parameters, really, of this period that starts in 1950 and goes onward through to the 80s from a Labour perspective. And then the second part, I want to look at how Labour dealt with it in the 50s. The first half is really to say that if you look at Labour history, they've not found winning elections very easy. There are reasons for this. The first, I think, is that Labour have never been very good losers, by which I mean they've not lost well. If you look at the 20th century, when the Conservatives lost, they most usually kind of reshape themselves and then win again in pretty short order. Yeah, if you look at it, I mean, when do they lose power? They lose power in 29. Okay, win a landslide in 31. Lose a landslide in 45, come close to winning in 50, win in 51. Lose in 64 and 66, which kind of go together, but then win in 70. Lose in 74 twice, win in 79. The exception, by the way, is 1997. After 1997, there's a decent argument saying the Tories went bananas. By contrast, though, post-defeat, Labour have always managed to make a bit of a hames of it. In part, this is because they're always prone to bitter infighting. A couple of examples might come to mind. After the defeat of 1970, they were bitterly divided between left and right and over Europe. After Gordon Brown's defeat in 2010, families couldn't even agree. I mean, the Miliband brothers, fight each other. Worse still, though, after defeat, they've had a tendency to go to the far left and, quite frankly, go mad. After the catastrophe of 1931, that sees them reduced to 52 MPs, they have George Lansbury as leader, an unelectable left-winger. After Thatcher's victory in 79, open warfare breaks out in Labour between what we call the Bennite left and the moderates. Michael Foot was elected leader. The SDP are created in the party split, and they run in the 1983 election on what Gerald Kaufman called the longest suicide note in history, and Thatcher won a landslide. 2015 saw Jeremy Corbyn, and that went well, didn't it? Managed to lose to Theresa May in 2017. How could anyone do that? And then lost big in 2020. Each time after going bonkers, Labour has had to be dragged back to something resembling electability. After Lansbury, Bevin and Attlee had to sort of drag the party back together. After Foot, Kinnock, Smith and Blair had to do the same. Labour were out of power for 18 years after 1979 and didn't actually win until it went very badly for Major's Conservatives. What will Keir Starmer do? Who knows? And what of the 50s, therefore? Well, what I'd probably say is the 50s, 51 and 55 are the first case. There were bitter divisions between what we call the Bevanite left and the moderate majority. 59, though, was the second case. And as we'll see, Gaitskell and Wilson have to, if you like, repair the damage. They managed to do so just as it goes wrong for the Conservatives. So, reason why I think Labour have struggled is they've always dealt badly with defeat. The second relates specifically to the 50s, but will occur again, by the way, in the 80s. And this is what we call the electoral cycle. This is very much a feature of the 50s, though. The Conservatives won in 55 and 59, but at the midpoint of the preceding governments, right, 51 to 55, 55 to 59 governments, Labour were ahead in the polls, well ahead in the case of 1958. Labour had a huge lead in 62-63, and the Conservatives damn nearly won in 64. Labour have got to break that pattern. They had to do the same in the 80s, by the way, well, after the 80s. The third thing that occurs to me is if you look at Labour history, they win, and I've used the phrase here, with a song in their hearts, which is actually taken from the 40s. But, let us face the future. Labour's 45 manifesto was big on the Beveridge report, big on the New Jerusalem, big on, we can create a better world for people. Wilson in 64 and 66, what we often nickname white heat, but was talking about a better Britain. Blair, things can only get better in 97. Perhaps 74 is an exception to this, we'll come to that another time. But generally speaking, when Labour spend their time whinging on about how terrible the Tories are, they lose 83, 87, 92, and of course in recent times, 2015, 2017 and 2020. What you've got to do is put optimistic cloak on the criticism. I think that's what works. Labour didn't really do that in the 50s, I think. The fourth thing is let's just look at the history. Labour actually haven't won all that often. Here's the list of outright Labour majorities: 45, 50, 64, 66, October 74, 97, 2001, 2005. You could add then two leading party and hung parliaments, 29, 74. Double that down, only 3 Labour leaders have ever won outright majorities: Attlee, Wilson, Blair. If you add MacDonald to the list, only 4 leaders have actually won elections. Only 4 Labour leaders. Since 1918, therefore, Adamson, Clunes, Henderson, Lansbury, Gaitskell, Callaghan, Kinnock, Smith, Brown, Miliband and Corbyn did not win the election between them. Of them, only Callaghan and Brown were Prime Minister. It's a kind of point made, isn't it? Au contraire, between 1906 and the Tory defeat of 1997, the only Tory leader who wasn't Prime Minister was Austen Chamberlain. Only Austen and Neville Chamberlain and Alec Douglas-Home didn't win any elections. If you take Tony Blair out of the equation, 3 big wins, 97, 01, 05, Labour have had just 2 big wins in their history, 1945 and 1966. The only big wins against incumbent Tory governments while I was actually in office were 45 and 97. And in 45, Labour had been in government since 1940. They only left the government a few weeks before after VE Day. Thus, before Blair, when Labour won, it had more often been narrowly or as the leading party in a hung parliament. One other thought. When you look at the Conservative defeats, that's what they are as much as Labour victories. 29, 45, 64, 74 and 97, I think, could all be seen as much as Conservative defeats as they can Labour victories. And then don't forget, between 1950 and 1992, there was an inbuilt bias to the electoral system towards the Conservatives, of somewhere usually between about 20 and 30 seats. Right? So, Labour were up against it in all kinds of ways. Or to put it another way, we shouldn't underestimate the victory of 1964. In other words, 1964 was bucking at least some kind of trends.